Take you back to one of our leading stories, and convicted rapist and killer Luyanda Botha back in the Wynberg Magistrates Court. This is in Cape Town this morning. Botha is on trial for the attempted rape of a nursing student back in 2014. He is right now serving 3 life sentences for the rape and murder of UCT student Emboldening in August of 2019. This student allegedly identified Botha as her assailant after the news broke of the rape and murder of Emboldening. To look at how, in a country like South Africa, we can build and strengthen a culture of speaking out when it comes to sexual violence and how to further support victims, we're joined by Lisa Vetten, who is a research associate at the Southern Centre for Inequality. Lisa, good morning. Just maybe to start out with your thoughts on how this attempted rape case came to light in the first place. It seems, by the account that we have in front of us, this survivor victim was emboldened by what happened, by the case involving Emboldening, and found her voice and was able to come forward.
Yes, that is very important, and it's not the first time that happens, that somebody observes another woman speaking out or justice being served in one situation, and that does, as you say, embolden and encourage them to think, well, now I can finally find and seek justice for myself. Of course, the most important thing is that when somebody does speak out and does go to report to the police, is that there is an actual follow-through in the sense of there being an arrest and a trial and a conviction should the evidence be sufficiently strong for that. Otherwise, if somebody speaks out hoping that they're going to get justice, and that is not the case, then it merely disappoints and I think undoes everything we tell victims in order to encourage them to speak out.
There's just, it sounds like, Lisa, and again, we'll get to hear the merits of the state's case and a lot more of the detail that is necessary to understand the complexity of this matter. But from what we understand so far, the complainant had initially made the complaint. The long and short of it is it was set down in, on the court roll. She did not appear. Our reporter says she had been subpoenaed, and then the matter was struck from the roll and then revisited, of course, years later when this news involving the person that she believes was her assailant, appears in connection with another case of violence, and in this case, a rape and murder. So there was that attempt to do something, and then that kind of fell through.
No, there is a great deal of support that is needed, especially in cases where the accused is a stranger. These are cases that often suffer the most in terms of investigation. Strangers are often much harder to track down than somebody you know, because obviously you have an identity, which you don't have in the case of a stranger. So they require a lot more work, both in terms of investigation and sometimes I think in terms of support for the complainant, because there is this fear that this person came out of nowhere and attacked you and they disappeared back into anywhere. So there's always this fear that you might bump into them, that having to go back and face them in court might just set up it just may be too difficult for you to be able to do at that particular point in time. So there's a great deal of different kinds of support that are required, when you've been raped by a stranger versus when you've been raped by somebody you know. The complexities of it might be slightly different, but the bottom line is that you do need support for somebody to be able to continue. And if they should want to withdraw for any reason, to be able to support them in that decision as well.
How do we, Lisa, because again, you and I have been speaking for many, many years. The country has been speaking for many, many years about the issue of GBV and how we do the things that you're asking that has to, that should be in place ordinarily. This is creating a culture of support, promoting a culture of speaking out, support for people who might feel very, very alone. I mean, these are, deeply personal and deeply violent, incidents that happen. Where are we? Because people come from any corner of South African society. Some places might be better set up to do that. There might be a more comprehensive support right from the time you go to a police station or even in your families. In other places, that might not necessarily be there.
That's entirely correct. I think that we have a serious problem with the unavailability and inaccessibility of services. And of course, once you move into rural areas, the situation becomes very much worse. I think there are also particular categories of victims whom we are simply failing. And here I'm thinking in particular of those who have intellectual disabilities. We have very few specialized services that can assist that particular category of victim and their cases are highly likely to never go anywhere because there is this perception in law that because they have an intellectual disability, they won't be credible and they won't be believed. And yet we've seen that there are services that can help somebody overcome those barriers and they can testify successfully. One of the difficulties, I think, is that we're just not seeing the kind of financial commitment that needs to go into services. I mean, in Gauteng, we've had a situation where for 3-4 months, the Gauteng Department of Social Development did not pay organizations to provide their services at victim-friendly rooms and the Thuthuzela care centers. So, you have a problem that there might be services available, but because they're not funded adequately, they're simply not there. People aren't there. So in many ways, I think, although the president told us earlier this year that something like 1.9 billion had been allocated towards gender-based violence, that figure was simply arrived at by lumping together total amounts spent, say, on the FCS unit or the sexual offences court. It wasn't telling us the nuts and bolts of how many counsellors do you have? Where are they placed? Where are there no counsellors? What is the kind of ongoing training and support that will be required? What kind of access are you providing to those who need more specialised care when they may need to see a psychologist or perhaps see a psychiatrist in some instances, because those are also in very short supply in South Africa. So that kind of basic planning, which often looks very boring, is not in place in terms of trying to calculate, this is the level of support that's needed, these are the kinds of resources that we need to put into place. Where do we have these resources? Where do we not have these resources?
Yeah. And what you're talking about, Lisa, represents the front line in the fight against GBV. And as you say, if it is not supported well enough, if we don't know exactly what the availability, training or the resource is, for that ban that is immediately, dealing with victims or where people are reporting to, we're certainly not going to make a great deal of progress, and we need that clarity and those answers. I want to talk about the different psyches, and Lisa, again, you have such an institutional knowledge and experience of dealing with victims or survivors of these types of attacks and assaults. What happens typically in a lot of these cases from a psychological perspective in the way that they respond to what's happened to them? Because there are different types of responses, and I think for people who might be directly affected, it would be interesting to know that not everyone reacts in the same way.
No, exactly. I think, and people move, and also you go through phases as you try to come to terms with what has happened and try to pick up your life again and to continue. So I think the most obvious right in the beginning is obviously shock, that sense of utter disbelief that this could have happened. If you knew the person, there could be this utter violation of trust and sense of betrayal, that this was somebody you trusted and thought you were safe with. I think all victims feel great fear. If this has happened to you once, the fear is there that this could happen again, especially when it goes to that trust of you don't know who you can trust anymore. I think where it has been a stranger, very often it can make it difficult. Sometimes it can make it very difficult for victims to leave their homes, because if they get on a taxi, what if he might be there? If they go here, might he be waiting for them? Sometimes, if you were in your own home, the break into your house may feel, I can't be here anymore. If you're raped in your own bed, you cannot sleep in that bed any longer. You need to be somewhere else. So I think there's that initial shock and disbelief, which once it wears off, can start to introduce symptoms of post-traumatic stress, where you may have difficulty sleeping, you may have great difficulty eating. There is that fear of other people, that mistrust. There's often great difficulties in concentrating. Your ability, because often your ability to think gets disrupted because these memories and images of what happened to you can intrude, and you can sometimes have flashbacks where you may be doing something, and then a memory will enter into your head and you'll start shaking, you'll start feeling very, very fearful, your mouth might go dry, and you start to remember what happened to you. And it feels very, very real, even though that might not be, even though it's not happening in the here and now, it's having that kind of physical response. So those kinds of responses, the worst of them can tend to decrease after about a month. If those symptoms still remain after a month, you probably have post-traumatic stress disorder and may require further assistance. There is some indication that after about 6 months, some victims do get better over time. The symptoms do decrease, but I think there's also a category of those for whom it just does not get better. And of course, if you're having other difficulties in your life at that time, for example, you may have lost a job, your relationship may have broken down, you may be having difficulties with children or other family members, you have other difficulties in life, then that will exacerbate the particular symptoms of the rape. And of course, if you've had any kind of trauma before, it may well evoke all those memories as well. So you may then have what is quite a complex and complicated response, where you're not just reacting to what has happened to you now, but also those other accumulated experiences in the past. So rape does affect people differently depending on their histories, depending on their coping abilities. If you are surrounded by friends and family who are supportive, never blame you, are there to hear and be there for you, that is a different experience when you feel alone and isolated and you don't have anyone to talk to and are fearful of what people will say if they find out. So we should never underestimate our own ability to be a healing presence to others.
Yeah. And if that happens where they don't find themselves in a supportive environment, it will limit us creating and engendering a culture of speaking out, wouldn't it, Lisa?
Yes, absolutely. And I think under those circumstances, that's where you really need services. If somebody is not able to talk to their family and friends, you need to have services so that they've got somewhere to go. Because, we are forever telling women to speak out, not be silent. But if we cannot hear, then actually that's a very empty message to be sending out.
Lisa, just a very quick final one. In this particular case, and again, I must disclaim, we don't know the circumstances around what happened with this case. We don't know too much about the person in question herself. But she did make this bid 10 years ago and seemingly abandoned it. She reanimated the bid and now she's here. And one would hope that her prospects for justice are going to be high, depending on what happens in court. But again, when things don't, go the way that you hope it would in terms of a conviction or, the obtaining of justice for yourself, I mean, that can offer a really serious setback, couldn't it?
Yes, very definitely. And I mean, this is one of the pieces of advice that you give to somebody who is pursuing a court case. And this is also what makes it so difficult, is once this goes to court, it's out of your control. It's out of your hands. The decisions belong to other people. And that, of course, can also be very disempowering. So and that one has to explore with people, that don't pin your entire life on the outcome of this case, because you don't know how it's going to go. Other people are going to make these decisions. So try to build your life and yourself and your support network, regardless of the outcome of what happens. One hopes justice will prevail, but should it not, for whatever reason, make sure that you are able to think about how you will continue and how you will continue to believe in yourself even after this has happened.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important for prosecutors and families to reinforce that message, that that a not guilty finding doesn't mean that the case, you did not tell the truth. Sometimes the evidence is simply not there, and in a criminal trial, the burden of proof is very, very high, about a 95% certainty. So that is something people just have to bear in mind.